This is the second part of the Environmental Extremes Global Engagement Series, presented by the Thermal Ergonomics Lab from Sydney. My name is George Havenith, and I'm going to discuss the second paper for this session, and the session has the theme of methodologies. The paper I want to discuss is the following. Relevance of individual characteristics for human heat stress response is dependent on exercise intensity and climate type, which was one of the papers I used for my PhD studies in the 1990s. So similar to the previous paper I discussed, I'm going to talk a bit about the why, the how, and the outcomes. So first, let's go for the why. So the background to my PhD funding was that they were looking for a way to select people that would do very well in the heat. So if you have a large group of people like in the pictures here, is there some way based on their individual characteristics or a simple test that you could check for how well they would perform in the heat? This is of course relevant to firefighter selection before they start the job, before they become a firefighter, or even keeping up their fitness levels is an issue in that. But also in the military, this can be quite important to select people for specific missions. And the idea behind it was to look at factors like age, sex, fitness, etc. So the questions asked were, how much of the differences in heat stress response can be explained by selected individual characteristics? What's the relative contribution of different parameters quantitatively? And finally, is it the same in different climates and for different work types? So let's start with participant selection and how that's done in different studies. And if you go to earlier literature than the paper we're talking about, we will find that if you look at, for example, a lot of the male-female comparison work from the 1960s, 70s, often no specific selection took place apart from a selection for a group of males and females. And these groups tended not to be matched. And later on, it was clear that that was not the right way to do it. So then later on, people start to select for everything but one parameter. So for example, in a male-female comparison, there would be a group of males and a group of females who had the same fitness, same body fat, etc., to make sure they identified purely the sex difference between the two. For the application that we were looking at, however, we thought we should do something different. And what we try to do here is we try to include interactions between parameters. And if you want to consider interactions, you need to vary multiple of parameters at the same time. So we selected groups with a wide variety of individual characteristics. So tall people, short people, heavy people, light people, fit people, unfit people, and brought them all into the same participant group. It's important, however, then to minimize correlations between individual characteristics. So if you want to separate out fitness level from body mass, you have to make sure that those are not correlated. So jumping ahead to the results, in the example we have here in the data set, for example, we did not have a correlation between VO2 max expressed per kilogram on one side and body fat, body mass, or body surface area on the other. So when studying this, the big discussion over the last 10 to 20 years has been how to define the exercise mode that you give to people. So at that time, when we were doing this, we thought we need to do two things. And if we look at real life tasks, they tend to be of two types. The first is if the task is done at a fixed speed. So let's say you have a queue of people handing over buckets in a queue, one to the next. They all carry the bucket, which has the same weight, and move it over the same distance. And that would be representative of work at a fixed workload. So everybody does exactly the same work, and everybody generates exactly the same amount of heat. The other model is that the task is adjusted to the person. So people work at a relative workload. So if you think about athletes running in a race, they typically run at a very similar percentage of their VO2 max. And that means the fitter they are, they generate more heat. And if you think about the military or the firefighters, that will also often be the case, is that the fitter people take on more than the unfit people. That's quite different from what has been done since. So if you look at what's happened in terms of these models over the last 15 years, mainly, we see that there's a big move towards using fixed watts per square meter models or fixed watt per kilogram models. And I think it would be very interesting when you discuss this paper to look at those models as well and see what the pros and cons of each approach are. So participant selection, in essence, we had 3 participant groups, and if we first look at the climate of all the conditions, so in the relative workload, we had 3 conditions, 35 degrees 80%, 45 degrees 20%. Those 2 are roughly similar in WBGT. And then we have the cool climate of 21 degrees 50%. For the absolute workload, we had 35 degrees 80% and 45 degrees 20%. Again, unfortunately, no cool climate. The participant groups were between 24 and 30, and each participant group was consisting of males and females. So there's a mixed sex there. That was also done to look at a wider range of individual characteristics than we often would achieve with males only. As you can see, there's 3 participant groups, so all the relative experiments were done with the same participants. So that was, you could say, within a participant experiment, but then the warm, humid, and hot, dry were done with different groups. But in the analysis, all the individual conditions were analyzed separately. Typically, what we were measuring was oxygen uptake, core temperature, skin blood flow, blood pressure, and heart rate. So this slide shows the distribution of the body temperature, so the rectal temperatures at the end of the test. So again, reiterating what the test was about. So we have relative intensity work in the top row, and that was a resting period of 30 minutes at 25% VO2 max, and 30 minutes at 45% VO2 max. So a total 90 minutes. And in the bottom row, we see the absolute exercise intensity, which was 30-minute rest, and then 60 minutes at 60 watts on an exercise bike. So the top, the relative load, was also on an exercise bike. So this is non-weight bearing exercise, which is again something you may want to consider. So let's look first at the straightforward correlations between the different parameters. And what we see here, this is VO2 max for the different climates, and the correlation that's shown here is of rectal temperature with maximal oxygen uptake here in liters per minute. So what we tend to see is that we see a strong negative correlation here in the absolute workload. That means that the fitter the people are, the lower the body temperature is, and that's true for both the climates. For the relative workloads, we see quite different. We have no significant correlations here between the cool and the hot dry climate, but we see a trend for a correlation in the warm humid climate, which is opposite and significantly opposite the warm humid and hot dry in the absolute work intensity. So that's quite interesting, is that we see a change in the relationship based on the climate type. Now, in the experimental group, VO2 max had some correlation with mass. So it's interesting to look at the relationship of VO2 max per kilogram with rectal temperature, as that did not correlate to mass. And there you see that a part of the absolute exercise intensity correlation disappears, so that becomes less. So probably part of that is related to mass, as we'll see later. But we see that in the warm humid climate, the positive correlation with rectal temperature becomes much stronger. So the fitter the people are in terms of VO2 max per kilogram, the higher their rectal temperature ends up to be at the end of the test if they do relative workloads. If we look at mass, so quite interesting, body mass has a negative correlation in all climates and is significant in 4 out of the 5 climates. It's not significant in the cool. But in most of the climates, the bigger the body mass was of the participants, the lower their rectal temperature at the end of the test. And finally, if we look at body fat percentage, we see that that only correlates in the cool climate and no significant correlation in any of the other climates. And in the cool climate, the higher the body fat percentage, so the higher the subcutaneous fat layer thickness, the warmer the people are. And the fact that it doesn't have any impact in the heat is related most likely to the higher blood flows that you find in the heat, which we also measured and was clearly evident. And when the blood flow to the skin is much higher, the resistance of the subcutaneous fat layer is more or less cut short. So the heat is transported by convection through the bloodstream rather than has to diffuse through the fat layer. So the main purpose of the paper of the study was to look at the interactions or the effect of multiple factors at the same time, for which we would do multiple regression analysis. And you will find many papers in the literature who have approached this problem in this way. But first, I want to talk a little bit about methodological issues that you see in some papers, or at least that I see in some papers, and it's for you to discuss those. So very often it's discussed by changes in R squared for each added parameter. So you add one parameter and you look how the R squared changes. So for example, if in step 1 of the regression analysis you find a significant parameter, SPSS or whatever statistical program you use picks the one with the highest correlation and puts that in. And for example, in this case, you would find an explained variance R squared of 60%. Now you go to step 2, you add parameter B, and now you find an R squared of 65%. And what you will find in discussion of a lot of these results is that people say A contributes 60% and B only 5%. So in some ways, A is 12 times more important than B. And in my view, that's wrong. The correct interpretation of this would be that B contributes only 5% after data are corrected for A. And that's quite something different to state. So that doesn't mean that A is 12 times more important than B. It's just that once you correct for A, B only adds 5%. Because if you would have just compared A and B on their own as single parameters, it could have well been that B would have explained 59.99%, just a tiny bit amount less than A. And that's enough reason for the statistical program to add A ahead of B. So I proposed a different approach, and that's discussing the relative importance of different parameters based on the standardized regression coefficient beta. So for those who are not familiar with beta, you have a normal coefficient in your regression equation, but the standardized regression coefficient can be best explained in this sentence. So it's a normalized coefficient which takes away the impact of the units, and it starts to express the effect in units of standard deviation. So if my parameter, so for example, I'm studying VO2 max effect on rectal temperature, if my parameter changes by 1 standard deviation, my measured variable changes by beta standard deviations. So if my beta would be 1 and I change my VO2 max in my group by 1 standard deviation, my rectal temperature would also be changing by 1 standard deviation based on the data that I've collected. So the bigger the beta, the more important the effect, and that beta is independent, as I said, of the units of the variable. So normally if you have, for example, degrees C versus degrees Fahrenheit or Kelvin, you would find in a regression equation, you find different coefficients, but the beta for all 3 of those analyses would be exactly the same. So what I did next is I took the beta for a certain parameter. So once you would, for example, have 2 factors or parameters or 3 parameters in an equation, you take the beta for each parameter and I divided it by the sum of all the betas for all parameters and took that as a ratio of R squared. And that's probably easier to see when I show you the outcomes. So here we have in the top row the outcomes for relative exercise intensity and in the bottom for absolute exercise intensity. And if I start to explain what we see here in the cool, so you see a pie chart, and in the pie chart you see a chunk which is attributed to body fat. So there's only one predictor here, and that predicts 26% of the total variance in the data, and 74% in this case, the residual is unexplained. So in this case, we can only predict 26% of the variation in rectal temperature by individual characteristics. And in this case, that's body fat. And as you saw before, body fat has a positive correlation. So that's what the plus here is about. And that means the higher the body fat level, the higher the rectal temperature in the cool environment. So if we then go to the mass, you see that mass didn't have an effect here in the cool, but it does have an effect in all the other climates and work loads that we have, although the impact size is quite different. So what we see, mass has a negative effect. So the higher the mass, the lower the core temperature. And that's also the case once we added a fitness indicator, in this case VO2 max per kilogram, to the equation. So that's a very stable effect. That's not influenced by VO2 max per kilogram, which, remember, was independent, was not correlated to mass if it's expressed that way. The size of the mass contribution is quite different between different parts, and strikingly, of course, here, if we go to the hot dry side, we see mass as the only predictor of the individual characteristics that add something to the explained variance, but it actually only explains 10%, and 90% of the explained variance is still 90% of the variance is still unexplained. So if you then go to VO2 max, so as a fitness indicator, so we analyze VO2, which you will find in a different figure in the paper, and this is VO2 max, and I show the VO2 max here because that was not correlated with mass. And what we see here, has an effect here in the absolute exercise intensity, and it's a negative correlation. So the higher your fitness level, the lower your rectal temperature is. And strikingly here in the warm humid environment, so the relative workload only appears in the warm humid environment, it has a positive correlation and explaining about 33% of the explained variance and it's positive. So that means in this case only, of all the conditions that we have, the higher the VO2 max is, the higher the rectal temperature. And that's an interesting thing. The contrast between the different conditions is quite interesting because that may reflect different aspects of VO2 max. So where in the absolute workload, I think VO2 max is representative for an improved heat loss capacity, and therefore it lowers the rectal temperature at the fixed heat load. In the warm humid climate with the relative workload, the warm humid climate doesn't allow all of the factors that improve heat loss by fitness, doesn't allow all those factors to come out, but the heat load by heat production, of course, is higher for people with a higher VO2 max and relative workload, and that expresses itself here as the main factor pushing the temperature up. So we also looked at body surface area, and that has a very similar effect to mass. So the bigger the body surface area, the lower the rectal temperature in all the conditions. And we looked at surface to mass ratio, which is also often considered, as in many papers you will find that a high surface to mass ratio is considered a good thing because you have a lot of cooling surface for a certain mass. But in this case, we found the correlations were a lot weaker than for surface area or mass on their own. And also there was a positive correlation with rectal temperature, which is opposite of what some other people suggest. So the higher the surface to mass ratio, so the smaller the person, the higher the core temperature. So just to show the distribution of the explained variances due to different parameters, this is the one where VO2 max is in here. I think it's interesting to look at the distributions of the rectal temperatures on the bottom right-hand corner. And what struck me quite strongly when I looked at this, we can see that if we look at the warm humid climate, we see on the bottom right-hand corner that that has the narrowest distribution. So the values for the rectal temperature are the closest together in the population of all the other conditions. So you would expect then there's little effect of individual parameters, but if you look at the warm humid condition here, you see that's where we actually were able to explain a lot of the variance in the data. So a lot of variance explained with a very narrow distribution here. I would have expected that where we have this wide distribution here in the hot, dry climate, for example, is that we would see a much better separation between individual characteristics. But looking at the top here, there's only mass that plays a role, and we actually have no idea what the explanation is for the other part of the variation. So that's another factor that might be interesting to discuss whether you have any ideas about that. So that brings me to the conclusions. So firstly, fat as an insulator, a subcutaneous fat layer, only impacts in a cool environment, and that's related to a low skin blood flow where it acts as an insulator. In the other conditions, skin blood flow is much higher and the insulation effect disappears due to the convective heat transfer by the blood from the core to the skin. VO2 max is linked to heat loss effectivity and heat generation, and the effect depends on the balance of the two. So whether the heat generation it has a bigger impact than the improved heat loss effectivity. So the lower rectal temperature for a higher VO2 max per kilogram at the same heat generation, so in the absolute experiment, same heat generation, we found a lower rectal temperature for a higher VO2 max suggests the impact of better heat dissipation at a high VO2 max. But if you go to the relative workload, we find the higher core temperature for the higher VO2 max in the humid, but not in the dry or cool. And that suggests that in this condition, the higher heat generation overrides the better heat dissipation. And that's in this case because the evaporation in the warm humid is limited. So the advantages cannot be expressed that well. Negative correlation of rectal temperature to mass and surface area, but weaker and positive relation to surface to mass ratio in all but the cool environment, indicates the importance of the heat sink. So the bigger the mass is, the longer it takes to warm up with a certain heat load. And the bigger the surface area is, the more cooling surface you have. But given that the surface to mass ratio was not working as suggested by Bergman and Allen, which you may be familiar with, it's discussed in the paper briefly. So that's a comparison between species, and that's the rule that more or less says that a big surface to mass ratio is beneficial in the tropics. So being small or very thin would be beneficial in the tropics, and being big or chunky would be beneficial in a cold environment, these papers are based on comparisons of different species and are often applied to human research, but these data don't support that that's the case for humans in these working conditions. So this is a study which is quite different from a lot of the other work, because we studied heterogeneous groups, and I think overall the work that we did in this way with the various papers we published worked quite well for real-world applications. Now, for pure mechanistic studies, that might be more complicated, and other models have been developed over the years in Ollie J's lab and Glenn Kenny's lab and other places to look at the mechanistics. I think one important thing for your discussion is to consider is whether any of these models is the only one, because I think that's what I often hear lately with students thinking, no, that's all wrong, it has to be done this way, or whether there is a place for each of these different models to study different types of problems. Due to space limitations at the time, we were unable to include all this specific data like sweat rates, etc. in this paper. If you're interested in the data set and you want to learn a bit more, you can find specific information in some of these papers where each individual data set has been discussed. Thanks for listening.